we will inform you about what the media is hiding. Who is Mартін Lютер Kінг? A Story from the Beginning. Part 4. King influenced Irish politician and activist John Hume. Hume, the former leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, cited King's legacy as quintessential to the Northern Irish civil rights movement and the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, calling him one of my great heroes of the century. The Mартін Lютер Kінг Fund and Foundation in the UK was set up as a charity on December 30, 1969, after the assassination of Mартін Lютher King Jr., and following a visit to the UK in 1969 by his widow, Lüter Kinq. The foundation's first chairman, Canon L. John Collins, stated that the foundation was to be an active UK national campaign for racial equality. Its work also to include community projects in areas of social need and education. International Personnel, an employment agency, was formed in 1970 out of the foundation's base in Bal, in London's Inner Ring South, to find employment for professionally qualified black people. In its first year, the agency placed 10% of its applicants in jobs equal to their ability. The Ballum training scheme operated an evening school at the premises in South London and had a director, coordinator, and 5 lecturers in typing, shorthand, English, and maths. The 1975 Mартін Lютер Kінг Memorial Lecture, entitled Black People and Employment, was given in the Mahatma Gandhi Hall of the Indian YMCA in London on May 6, 1975, by the RT. Rev. David Shepherd, who was chairman of the fund until his appointment as Bishop of Liverpool in June 1975. In the late 1970s, Wilfred Wood, a Barbadian British Anglican, Bishop of Croydon from 1985 to 2003, the first black bishop in the Church of England, and instrumental in the establishment of the foundation, became its chair. Wood was second in the 100 Great Black Britons list in 2004. The 1989 Mартін Lютher Kінг Memorial Lecture, entitled To Overcome is to Undertake, was given by the RT Rev. Wilfred Wood, Bishop of Croydon. The text is still available. The foundation was removed from the Charity Commission list on November 18, 1996, as it had ceased to exist. In the United Kingdom today, the Northumbria and Newcastle University's Mартін Lютher Kінг Peace Committee still exists to honor King's legacy, as represented by his final visit to the UK to receive an honorary degree from Newcastle University in 1967. The Peace Committee operates out of the chaplaincies of the city's 2 universities, Northumbria and Newcastle, both of which remain centers for the study of Mартін Lютher Kінг and the U.S. civil rights movement. Inspired by King's vision, it undertakes a range of activities across the UK as it seeks to build cultures of peace. In 2017, Newcastle University unveiled a bronze statue of King to celebrate the 50th anniversary of his honorary doctorate ceremony. The Students' Union also voted to rename their bar Luther's. King has become a national icon in the history of American liberalism and American progressivism. His main legacy was to secure progress on civil rights in the U.S. Just days after King's assassination, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Title 8 of the Act, commonly known as the Fair Housing Act, prohibited discrimination in housing and housing-related transactions on the basis of race, religion, or national origin. This legislation was seen as a tribute to King's struggle in his final years to combat residential discrimination in the U.S. The day following King's assassination, school teacher Jane Elliott conducted her first Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes exercise with her class of elementary school students in Riceville, Iowa. Her purpose was to help them understand King's death as it related to racism, something they little understood as they lived in a predominantly white community. King's wife Coretta Scott King followed in her husband's footsteps and was active in matters of social justice and civil rights until her death in 2006. The same year that Mартін Lютher Kінг was assassinated, she established the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, dedicated to preserving his legacy and the work of championing nonviolent conflict resolution and tolerance worldwide. Their son, Dexter King, serves as the center's chairman. Daughter Yolanda King, who died in 2007, was a motivational speaker, author, and founder of Higher Ground Productions, an organization specializing in diversity training. Even within the King family, members disagree about his religious and political views about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. King's widow Coretta publicly said that she believed her husband would have supported gay rights. However, his youngest child, Ernest King, has said publicly that he would have been opposed to gay marriage. On February 4, 1968, at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, in speaking about how he wished to be remembered after his death, King stated, "I'd like somebody to mention that day that Mартін Lютher King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Mартін Lютher King Jr. tried to love somebody." I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. And I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. But I just want to leave a committed life behind. Mартін Лютер Кінг Jr. was among hundreds of artists whose material was destroyed in the 2008 Universal Studios fire. Beginning in 1971, cities such as St. Louis, Missouri, and states established annual holidays to honor King. At the White House Rose Garden on November 2, 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill creating a federal holiday to honor King. Observed for the first time on January 20, 1986, it is called Mартін Luther King Jr. Day. Following President George H.W. Bush's 1992 proclamation, the holiday is observed on the third Monday of January each year, near the time of King's birthday. On January 17, 2000, for the first time, Mартін Luther King Jr. Day was officially observed in all 50 U.S. states. Arizona, New Hampshire, and Utah were the last 3 states to recognize the holiday. Utah previously celebrated the holiday at the same time, but under the name Human Rights Day. King was canonized by Archbishop Timothy Paul of the Holy Christian Orthodox Church on September 9, 2016, at the Christian Cathedral in Springfield, Massachusetts. His feast day was set as April 4th, the date of his assassination. King is also honored with a lesser feast on the liturgical calendar of the Episcopal Church on April 4th or January 15th, the anniversary of his birth. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America commemorates King liturgically on January 15th. As a Christian minister, King's main influence was Jesus Christ and the Christian Gospels, which he would almost always quote in his religious meetings, speeches at church, and in public discourses. King's faith was strongly based in Jesus' commandment of loving your neighbor as yourself, loving God above all, and loving your enemies, praying for them and blessing them. His nonviolent thought was also based in the injunction to turn the other cheek in the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus' teaching of putting the sword back into its place. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, King urged action consistent with what he describes as Jesus' extremist love, and also quoted numerous other Christian pacifist authors, which was very usual for him. In another sermon, he stated, "Before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my first calling, and it still remains my greatest commitment. You know, actually all that I do in civil rights I do because I consider it a part of my ministry. I have no other ambitions in life but to achieve excellence in the Christian ministry. I don't plan to run for any political office. I don't plan to do anything but remain a preacher. And what I'm doing in this struggle, along with many others, grows out of my feeling that the preacher must be concerned about the whole man." King's private writings show that he rejected biblical literalism. He described the Bible as mythological, doubted that Jesus was born of a virgin, suggested he may not have been bodily resurrected, and did not believe that the story of Jonah and the whale was true. In 1959, King published a short book called The Measure of a Man, which contained his sermons What is Man? And the Dimensions of a Complete Life. The sermons argued for man's need for God's love and criticized the racial injustices of Western civilization. Veteran African-American civil rights activist Bayard Rustin was King's first regular advisor on nonviolence. King was also advised by the white activists Harris Wofford and Glenn Smiley. Rustin and Smiley came from the Christian pacifist tradition, and Wofford and Rustin both studied Mahatma Gandhi's teachings. Rustin had applied nonviolence with the Journey of Reconciliation campaign in the 1940s, and Wofford had been promoting Gandhism to Southern blacks since the early 1950s. King had initially known little about Gandhi and rarely used the term nonviolence during his early years of activism in the early 1950s. King initially believed in and practiced self-defense, even obtaining guns in his household as a means of defense against possible attackers. The pacifists guided King by showing him the alternative of nonviolent resistance, arguing that this would be a better means to accomplish his goals of civil rights than self-defense. King then vowed to no longer personally use arms. In the aftermath of the boycott, King wrote Stride Toward Freedom, which included the chapter Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. King outlined his understanding of nonviolence, which seeks to win an opponent to friendship, rather than to humiliate or defeat him. The chapter draws from an address by Wofford, with Rustin and Stanley Levison also providing guidance in ghostwriting. King was inspired by Gandhi and his success with nonviolent activism, and as a theology student, King described Gandhi as being one of the individuals who greatly reveal the working of the Spirit of God. King had for a long time wanted to take a trip to India. With assistance from Harris Wofford, the American Friends Service Committee, and other supporters, he was able to fund the journey in April 1959. The trip to India affected King, deepening his understanding of nonviolent resistance and his commitment to America's struggle for civil rights. In a radio address made during his final evening in India, King reflected, "Since being in India, I am more convinced than ever before that the method of nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for justice and human dignity." King's admiration of Gandhi's nonviolence did not diminish in later years. He went so far as to hold up his example when receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, hailing the successful precedent of using nonviolence in a magnificent way by Mohandas K. Gandhi to challenge the might of the British Empire. He struggled only with the weapons of truth, soul force, non-injury, and courage. Another influence for King's nonviolent method was Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience and its theme of refusing to cooperate with an evil system. He also was greatly influenced by the works of Protestant theologians Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, and said that Walter Rauschenbusch's Christianity and the social crisis left an indelible imprint on his thinking by giving him a theological grounding for his social concerns. King was moved by Rauschenbusch's vision of Christians spreading social unrest in perpetual but friendly conflict with the state, simultaneously critiquing it and calling it to act as an instrument of justice. However, he was apparently unaware of the American tradition of Christian pacifism exemplified by Adnan Ballou and William Lloyd Garrison. King frequently referred to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as central for his work. King also sometimes used the concept of agape. However, after 1960, he ceased employing it in his writings. Even after renouncing his personal use of guns, King had a complex relationship with the phenomenon of self-defense in the movement. He publicly discouraged it as a widespread practice, but acknowledged that it was sometimes necessary. Throughout his career, King was frequently protected by other civil rights activists who carried arms, such as Colonel Stone Johnson, Robert Haling, and the Deacons for Defense and Justice. King was criticized by other black leaders during the course of his participation in the civil rights movement. This included opposition by more militant thinkers such as Nation of Islam member Malcolm X. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee founder Ella Baker regarded King as a charismatic media figure who lost touch with the grassroots of the movement as he became close to elite figures like Nelson Rockefeller. Stokely Carmichael, a protege of Baker, became a black separatist and disagreed with King's plea for racial integration because he considered it an insult to a uniquely African American culture. He also took issue that King's nonviolence approach depended on appealing to America's conscience, feeling America had none to appeal to. King was an avid supporter of Native American rights. Native Americans were also active supporters of King's civil rights movement, which included the active participation of Native Americans. In fact, the Native American Rights Fund was patterned after the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund. The National Indian Youth Council was especially supportive in King's campaigns, especially the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. In King's book Why We Can't Wait, he writes, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original America, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it." King assisted Native American people in South Alabama in the late 1950s. At that time, the remaining Creek in Alabama were trying to completely desegregate schools in their area. The South had many racial problems. In this case, light-complexioned Native children were allowed to ride school buses to previously all-white schools, while dark-skinned Native children from the same band were barred from riding the same buses. Tribal leaders, upon hearing of King's desegregation campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, contacted him for assistance. He promptly responded, and through his intervention the problem was quickly resolved. In September 1959, King flew from Los Angeles, California, to Tucson, Arizona. After giving a speech at the University of Arizona on the ideals of using nonviolent methods in creating social change, he put into words his belief that one must not use force in this struggle but match the violence of his opponents with his suffering. King then went to Southside Presbyterian, a predominantly Native American church, and was fascinated by their photos. On the spur of the moment, King wanted to go to an Indian reservation to meet the people, so Casper Glenn took King to the Papago Indian Reservation. At the reservation, King met with all the tribal leaders, and others on the reservation then ate with them. King then visited another Presbyterian church near the reservation and preached there, attracting a Native American crowd. He later returned to Old Pueblo in March 1962, where he preached again to a Native American congregation, and then went on to give another speech at the University of Arizona. King would continue to attract the attention of Native Americans throughout the civil rights movement. During the 1963 March on Washington, there was a sizable Native American contingent, including many from South Dakota and many from the Navajo Nation. Native Americans were also active participants in the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. King was a major inspiration, along with the civil rights movement, of the Native American rights movement of the 1960s and many of its leaders. John Echo Hawk, a member of the Pawnee tribe who was the executive director and a founder of the Native American Rights Fund, stated, inspired by Dr. King, who was advancing the civil rights agenda of equality under the laws of this country, we thought that we could also use the laws to advance our Indianship, to live as tribes in our territories governed by our own laws under the principles of tribal sovereignty that had been with us ever since 1831. We believed that we could fight for a policy of self-determination that was consistent with U.S. law, and that we could govern our own affairs, define our own ways, and continue to survive in this society. As the leader of the SCLC, King maintained a policy of not publicly endorsing a U.S. political party or candidate. I feel someone must remain in the position of non-alignment, so that he can look objectively at both parties and be the conscience of both, not the servant or master of either. In a 1958 interview, he expressed his view that neither party was perfect, saying, I don't think the Republican Party is a party full of the Almighty God, nor is the Democratic Party. They both have weaknesses, and I'm not inextricably bound to either party. King did praise Democratic Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois as being the greatest of all senators because of his fierce advocacy for civil rights causes over the years. King critiqued both parties' performance on promoting racial equality. Actually, the Negro has been betrayed by both the Republican and the Democratic Party. The Democrats have betrayed him by capitulating to the whims and caprices of the Southern Dixiecrats. The Republicans have betrayed him by capitulating to the blatant hypocrisy of reactionary right-wing Northern Republicans. And this coalition of Southern Dixiecrats and right-wing reactionary Northern Republicans defeats every bill and every move towards liberal legislation in the area of civil rights. Although King never publicly supported a political party or candidate for president, in a letter to a civil rights supporter in October 1956, he said that he had not decided whether he would vote for Adlai Stevenson II or Dwight D. Eisenhower at the 1956 presidential election, but that in the past, I always voted the Democratic ticket. In his autobiography, King says that in 1960 he privately voted for Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. I felt that Kennedy would make the best president. I never came out with an endorsement. My father did, but I never made one. King adds that he likely would have made an exception to his non-endorsement policy for a second Kennedy term, saying had President Kennedy lived, I would probably have endorsed him in 1964. In 1964, King urged his supporters and all people of goodwill to vote against Republican Senator Barry Goldwater for president, saying that his election would be a tragedy and certainly suicidal almost for the nation and the world. King supported the ideals of democratic socialism, although he was reluctant to speak directly of this support due to the anti-communist sentiment being projected throughout the United States at the time, and the association of socialism with communism. King believed that capitalism could not adequately provide the necessities of many American people, particularly the African American community. King expressed that the evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and evils of racism. In a 1952 letter to Coretta Scott, he said, I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. In one speech, he stated that something is wrong with capitalism, and said, there must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. King further said that capitalism has outlived its usefulness and failed to meet the needs of the masses. King had read Marx while at Morehouse, but while he rejected traditional capitalism, he rejected communism because of its materialistic interpretation of history that denied religion, its ethical relativism, and its political totalitarianism. King stated that Black Americans, as well as other disadvantaged Americans, should be compensated for historical wrongs. In an interview conducted for Playboy in 1965, he said that granting Black Americans only equality could not realistically close the economic gap between them and whites. King said that he did not seek a full restitution of wages lost to slavery, which he believed impossible, but proposed a government compensatory program of $50 billion over 10 years to all disadvantaged groups. He posited that the money spent would be more than amply justified by the benefits that would accrue to the nation through a spectacular decline in school dropouts, family breakups, crime rates, illegitimacy, swollen relief rolls, rioting, and other social evils. He presented this idea as an application of the common law regarding settlement of unpaid labor, but clarified that he felt that the money should not be spent exclusively on blacks. He stated, it should benefit the disadvantaged of all races. Actress Nichelle Nichols planned to leave the science fiction television series Star Trek in 1967 after its first season, wanting to return to musical theater. She changed her mind after talking to King, who was a fan of the show. King explained that her characters signified a future of greater racial harmony and cooperation. King told Nichols, "You are our image of where we're going. You're 300 years from now, and that means that's where we are and it takes place now. Keep doing what you're doing. You are our inspiration." As Nichols recounted, Star Trek was one of the only shows that and his wife Coretta would allow their little children to watch. And I thanked him and I told him I was leaving the show. All the smile came off his face, and he said, "Don't you understand, for the first time we're seen as we should be seen. You don't have a black role. You have an equal role." For his part, the series creator, Gene Roddenberry, was deeply moved upon learning of King's support. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally ordered surveillance of King, with the intent to undermine his power as a civil rights leader. The Church Committee, a 1975 investigation by the U.S. Congress, found that from December 1963 until his death in 1968, Mартін Лютер Кінг Jr. was the target of an intensive campaign by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to neutralize him as an effective civil rights leader. In the fall of 1963, the FBI received authorization from Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy to proceed with wiretapping of King's phone lines, purportedly due to his association with Stanley Levison. The Bureau informed President John F. Kennedy. He and his brother unsuccessfully tried to persuade King to dissociate himself from Levison, a New York lawyer who had been involved with Communist Party USA. Although Robert Kennedy only gave written approval for limited wiretapping of King's telephone lines on a trial basis for a month or so, Hoover extended the clearance so his men were unshackled to look for evidence in any areas of King's life they deemed worthy. The Bureau placed wiretaps on the home and office phone lines of both Levison and King, and bugged King's rooms in hotels as he traveled across the country. In 1967, Hoover listed the SCLC as a black nationalist hate group, with the instructions, "No opportunity should be missed to exploit through counterintelligence techniques the organizational and personal conflicts of the leaderships of the groups, to ensure the targeted group is disrupted, ridiculed, or discredited." In a secret operation codenamed Minaret, the National Security Agency monitored the communications of leading Americans, including King, who were critical of the U.S. war in Vietnam. A review by the NSA itself concluded that Minaret was disreputable if not outright illegal. Soon, we will publish Part 5. Thank you for watching.